Good afternoon, everyone. I think we have someone joining on Zoom. It's really nice to see you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Marie Harf, Executive Director of Perry World House. Welcome to our first World Today program of the year. As many of you know, and for those of you who are new to our programming, Perry World House is the hub for global engagement on campus here at Penn. And as we start this new academic year, and we are getting close to our 10th anniversary in 2026, it's really notable to think about how much the world has changed since we first opened our doors in 2016. In a year that will see more people than ever before going to the polls globally, there have already been multiple elections of consequence in France, India, Iran, Venezuela, of course, in 54 days. Although in Pennsylvania you can vote earlier than that, as you all know, here in our own country. Conflict continuing in the Middle East, Ukraine, and Sudan, and far too many other places. Technology that's rapidly shifting the global landscape through advances in AI, blockchain, and autonomous systems. And of course, climate change that continues to wreak havoc on our planet, with 2024 being the hottest summer in history and massive storms and flooding affecting people around the globe. In this changing world, we will continue doing here what we've been doing over the past 8 years, putting together faculty, policymakers, activists, NGOs, and others to discuss these pressing global issues, not just admiring the problems, but working on real solutions to fix them. This year, we have launched 4 new pillars of work here at Perry World House. That's what we're here to talk about today. Democracy, security, climate change, and human rights and global justice. These 4 areas represent both the biggest threats to global stability, but also the areas in which we believe we can make the most significant impact. Some of these themes are building on past successful work, and some are new, most notably our democracy pillar. To discuss these issues and the state of the world today, I am honored to be joined on stage and on the screen behind us by 4 faculty members who will be looking at the world through the lens of their own experience on democracy, climate change, security, and human rights and global justice, and who are really setting the stage for all of our work this year. I'm going to introduce each of them, and we'll have a conversation, and I'd love to open it up to questions from all of you. I'll start on the screen, looking over us, with Zaid Ra'ad Al-Hussein, who is currently the president and CEO of the International Peace Institute and Perry World House Professor of the Practice of Law and Human Rights here at Penn. He leads our human rights pillar. Previously, he served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, twice as Jordan's ambassador to the United Nations, and once as Jordan's ambassador to the United States. In January 2014, he served as president of the UN Security Council, and earlier, in 2002, was elected the first president of the governing body of the International Criminal Court, guiding the court's growth in its first 3 years, from 2002 to 2005. He also represented Jordan twice before the International Court of Justice, and from 1994 to 1996 served as a UN civilian peacekeeper. Dean Sarah Benet-Weiser, one of our faculty leads for our democracy work, is the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn, and also its Lauren Berlant Professor of Communication. In addition, she is a research professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and the founding director of the Center for Collaborative Communication at the Annenberg Schools. Her teaching and research interests include gender in the media, identity, citizenship, and cultural politics, consumer culture, popular media, race in the media, and intersectional feminism. Michael Horowitz, who leads our security pillar work, has just returned as director of Perry World House and Richard Perry Professor at Penn after 2 years at the Pentagon, serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities. His research interests include the intersection of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotics with global politics, military innovation, and the role of leaders in international politics. Michael Weisberg is Deputy Director of Perry World House, leads our climate pillar here, along with Jeannie Birch, as well as the Bess W. Heyman President's Professor at Penn. He's a philosopher of science and senior negotiator at the UN Climate Conferences, editor-in-chief of Biology and Philosophy, director of the Penn Laboratory for Understanding Science, and the director of the Galapagos Education and Research Alliance. He also serves as senior advisor to the Maldivian Minister of Environment and advisor to the Maldivian Ambassador to the United Nations. It's a very distinguished panel today. I'm so glad you could all join us. Let's get to the real conversation. I'm going to start with a lightning round for all of our 4 panelists before we dive in a little deeper. In all of your diverse areas, and there's certainly a lot of overlap between the 4, which we'll talk about today, what is the one thing that keeps you up at night the most? Michael? This is a lightning round, and we're going to really get into the details here.
First, thank you, Marie, and it's really, Mike, really great to have you back, and Sarah and Zaid, great to share the stage with you.
Wait until you hear what I have to say.
Yeah, maybe not. No, I'll make it very short. So you mentioned it's the hottest summer on record, so when the temperature gets above 35 degrees with 100% humidity, that means that we can't survive outside. So I think my greatest fear from the climate perspective is that we're teetering on the edge of that possibility, and that would lead to mass casualty events of the sort that we've never seen before. So, not a great place to start.
Thanks for getting us started with that.
That is what keeps me up at night.
And just as a preview, we're going to end on a little more positive note today, but Dean, Liza, do you want to follow that?
Sure. Yeah, that was really depressing and sad. I don't think I'm going to be that much less depressing. And what keeps me up at night, we were talking earlier, there's lots of things that keep me up at night that have to do with democracy and democratic practice. I think that the thing that terrifies me the most right now is not just the rising authoritarianism across the world, but excuse me, the normalization of authoritarianism across the world.
Mike?
I'd say promoting and sustaining U.S. political, economic, and military leadership in the face of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China.
And Zaid, I'm coming to you on the screen. What's the top thing that keeps you up at night?
Well, thank you, Marie. I suppose it's the fragility of all of what we hold dear, whether it's within states or between states. Everything seems so tenuous and so prone to disruption. And the lack of sort of original thinking to overturn this sort of weakness that we see almost creeping into every area of our experience. If we can see and seize on some initiatives that are creative and can change the dynamic, then I'm all for that, of course.
Thank you. So now I'll go through each of these pillars, and picking up on what Zaid said, I mean, this is why we exist, to bring that kind of creative thinking that taps into Penn's vast intellectual resources and bring that to bear on the policy community. And there's no better person to start with to talk about that intersection between the academy and policymaking than Professor Horowitz, who, as I said, just got back from a 2-year stint at the Pentagon, focusing on force development and emerging capabilities. Let's start there, coming from Penn to the Pentagon and now back. Expand a little bit upon what you said about the most important security issues facing the U.S. Is that what keeps you up at night? Are there others you'd add to the competition with the PRC?
Oh, thanks. It's a real honor to be back here and to see people in the audience that I've missed over the last couple of years, and to see a bunch of new friends and see Zaid on screen. Like, what a thrill! And I've also been basically locked in a metal box for 12 hours a day for the last 2.5 years, and so it's great to be free, see sunlight.
You can tweet whatever you want now.
I mean, I could tweet whatever I want. Is that wise? I don't know. I think it's a dangerous world out there. The response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing conflict in Gaza, the Red Sea, what's going on in the Red Sea. I mentioned at the outset the rise of the PRC. There are huge security challenges that face the United States, and the world. And let me expand a little bit on why I mentioned the PRC in particular, since it's often not in the headlines, right? What's in the headlines? What's in the headlines, or from an international security perspective, are usually the ongoing wars. How is Ukraine doing against Russia? What's the U.S. doing in that context? What's going on in the conflict between Israel and Hamas? What's going on with the Houthis firing missiles, all over the Middle East, and at U.S. ships in the U.S. ships in the Gulf. But the PRC is the only country that presents a short-term and long-term economic and political challenge to U.S. leadership. The combination of their desire to become a global leader in artificial intelligence, for example, and their much more repressive vision of what they would do with artificial intelligence, their missiles, ship purchases, other military advances, make that's why in the 2022 National Defense Strategy, the PRC was identified as the quote pacing challenge, the thing that the United States needs to focus on the most. And so a real challenge from a security perspective right now is you have all of these things happening every day. Like I just mentioned some wars, but there are also things that others will mention, as well. Their climate challenges, challenges to democracy, challenges to human rights. All of this stuff is swirling around, but in the background, every day, there's the huge challenge posed by the PRC and a different vision of what the world should look like than the United States. And it's an enormous security challenge that I spent a lot of time thinking about in the Pentagon. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind, whether you're thinking about this from an American perspective or a global perspective.
So in regards to China, or just in general, you work on new technologies, how are these new technologies changing that security landscape? And I guess specifically with AI, I think there's a lot of concern about it, right? How do we balance the benefits and risks when it comes to security in this context where you talked about China's looking at using it in a very different way than we are?
There are lots of emerging technologies shaping our world. Artificial intelligence, quantum, space, biotechnology, et cetera. But AI really lies at the heart of all of it. You're talking about a transformational general purpose technology with economic, societal, and military consequences. And there are real dilemmas it raises, both from a US domestic perspective and a global perspective. For example, domestically, we want to ensure that both American companies are leading innovators in artificial intelligence and that applications of it protect people's rights and safety. But we also want to do that without undermining the ability of our military and intelligence communities to adopt artificial intelligence with responsible speed. That meaning as quickly as we can, consistent with our values. And meanwhile, the PRC, and Xi has talked explicitly about the desire to make the PRC a global leader, in part through leading in AI. And autocratic countries have a different vision of thinking about artificial intelligence. Democratic countries, and the United States in particular, we tend to think about artificial intelligence as something to empower people, because we think of our people as the best in the world. And I mean that especially from an American military perspective, but also more broadly. Whereas more autocratic countries, well, they don't trust their people in the first place. If they trusted their people, they might have different political regimes. But what that means is they're more likely to try to use emerging technologies to try to control, to try to repress, and to try to replace. And so there's a real contrast in values there in thinking about what applications of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies might look like. And so we've ended up in some ways in what I'd call a competition of coalitions, which is why it's so important for the United States not only be a beacon of freedom for the world, but a good collaborator and partner with the world.
And of course, the challenges and questions around AI go beyond the security realm. Turning next to Sarah, for those of you, this may be the first time Taylor Swift has been name-checked at a Perry Woodhouse event, but correct me if I'm wrong, for those of you who've been here longer. When Taylor Swift made her endorsement in the presidential race this week, she said it was in part because AI had generated disinformation that had been thrown around the internet saying that she had endorsed someone she hadn't. So the challenges with AI go far beyond weapon systems. Turning now to the media and democracy, Sarah, which you are an expert on, what do you consider right now to be the biggest challenge for democratic systems? We hear a lot about misinformation and disinformation. I just mentioned a piece of it that has had an impact on our presidential election. Is it sort of media silos, polarized sources of media? Is it propaganda? These are all huge challenges, but how do you rank them or look at them in today's context?
Yes, thank you. And also, it is such an honor to be on this panel. I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity. I will say though that I was going to name check Taylor Swift.
Oh, no.
And you did it. It was in my notes, and it was about AI. And so, but I will also say that aside from in her post where she questioned the use of her in a AI image. That where she was said to be endorsing Donald Trump, she also endorsed Harris, and in the few hours that followed that Instagram post, which happened after the debate on Tuesday night, over 300,000 people went to vote.gov to register to vote. So I think that parasocial relationships, even with celebrities, are not something that we should scoff at and really kind of take seriously, especially in the context of democracy and media, which is your question. I think that there are lots of incredible experts and scholars at Penn who tell us and teach us about all the different mechanisms of democracy, from the political mechanisms to the economic mechanisms. But I wanted to kind of focus a little bit today on feelings. And the way in which democracy depends on particular kinds of feelings. And by feelings, I mean trust, I mean confidence, I mean equality, thinking about equality, accessibility. And I'm a media scholar, as Marie pointed out, and all of those things have to do with the way in which we understand and participate in the media. The media, I would say, is absolutely crucial for any democracy, not just through news and information, but also through analysis and opinion and satire. It is the key route to which publics hear about politics. It plays an enormous role in shaping what the public agenda might be, forming public opinion. And the media in a democracy doesn't just depend on information and sharing news, but it does depend, but also depends on trust and confidence. There have been, so I'm going to just depart a tiny bit from you, Mike, and thinking about autocratic, versus democratic uses of the media, because I think democratic uses of the media too are also about control lots of times. And I think that the reason, not in the same way, obviously, but I think that there have been major changes in the media throughout the world in the last few decades. Most importantly, I think the media market has drastically changed. It has led to devastating cuts in local and investigative journalism. It has amplified polarizing rhetoric and misinformation. Why? Because polarizing rhetoric and misinformation sells. It's a lucrative mechanism, and when you have media platforms that are owned by billionaires who are looking to make a profit, you can't really think that they're actually interested in whether or not we trust them and whether or not the information is true. So we know these sensationalist stories get the most clicks. We know they make the most money. We know that monopoly ownership over our media networks, our media platforms, can lead to a particular kind of control, or at least controlling the message and controlling the narrative. And so misinformation and disinformation, which you had asked me whether or not there's a difference between them. I mean, technically, misinformation is inadvertently sending information that is false. Disinformation is intentionally sending information that is false or misleading. I think it's pretty hard to tell the difference.
They have the same impact.
They have the same impact, and I misinformation, if you're gonna say, did you intend to do that? Did you intend to send that story? But I think that we see it in elections across the globe. We see the kind of tragic impact that misinformation has had. We see it in voter suppression and repression. We see it in the ways in which marginalized groups are made even more marginalized through hyperbolic stories that are false and misleading. We saw it at the debate on Tuesday night about a misleading story. So I think that any democracy depends on informing its citizens, right? We teach our students here at Penn to be informed citizens, and we teach them to be discerning when it comes to the media and to know how to figure out whether or not a message is fake or true. And I think that we need to be ever more vigilant about that because it's becoming harder and harder for precisely the reasons that you have pointed out, Mike, about AI. I won't even like a tweet anymore because I don't know if what is contained in that tweet has been manipulated in some way. And so media manipulation is an absolutely crucial area for us to contend with if we want to have a healthy democracy, if we want to continue to think that informed citizenry is the reason that democracy works.
And one of the topics we will explore this year as part of the democracy pillar, but that I just want to follow up with you about is you ended with an if question. If we want to continue to have a democracy, if we want to keep seeing if democracy works, we've seen a disturbing trend where voters in many countries around the world are using democratic processes to elect non-democratic leaning leaders. In many respects, forfeiting their own rights in the sake of stability or security or name whatever you would like there. I wonder if you can just say, because you ended with an if. And we hear a lot of Americans today, for a variety of reasons, saying they're not sure our democracy works for them anymore. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure, I think it's always important to end with an if, by the way, because it offers up a space for us to think about the conditions of possibility, regardless of what we are talking about. Yet there's lots of really important policy work and scholarship about democratic backsliding, where it is seen to, democratic backsliding is seen to be occurring in an unprecedented number of wealthy countries that once were thought to be immune from those kinds of forces, the United States among them. And I think that increasingly what these reports and policies are telling us is that increasingly threats to democracy aren't really emerging from military coups, right, or military aggressions or civil wars, although of course those are still happening and those still do threaten democracy. But they are emerging from autocratic leaders who leverage democratic institutions, things like elections, elected officials, legislators, courts, and the media to consolidate this kind of power. And so I think this is something that we need to really be kind of paying attention to in all its elements. I was at a seminar here at Perry World House last week, I think it was last week or the week before, with Par Zetterberg, where he gave this talk about just this, that how autocrats deploy what he called gender washing as a way to leverage the concept of democracy to say, look at our gender equality, look at all our female representatives, look how progressive we are in terms of democracy, precisely as a way to obscure the autocratic leadership as a sort of veneer or an alibi for that. And we see populism expanding, gaining ground across the world. And so I think we need to kind of pay attention to what democratic backsliding means. We saw in the elections, Marie, that you mentioned at the beginning in Europe, that far-right parties are perhaps most significantly recently in Europe, at least in France and in Germany, also in the United Kingdom, are building genuine momentum. And they're turning potential governments, turning into kind of potential governments that will be hostile to other sorts of governance that we've had in the past, such as EU and other sorts of organizations. So I think democratic backsliding is happening and we need to kind of be aware of it. I will say that I also think that threats to things like equality, democracy, civil rights don't just happen without a response. And so I think that when we're talking about democracy, we also need to talk about the response to democratic backsliding and to think about how we may harness that power and that energy. Protests are happening across the world in numbers that I haven't seen in a really long time for a variety of different reasons and different causes. And so I think that while we recognize democratic backsliding and think about how it is that autocrats are using democratic tenets as a way to obscure their consolidation of power, we also have to remember that actually if democracy is about the people, there are people out there who are protesting this, who are challenging this. It's not just happening, to a bunch of complacent citizens, right?
That's right, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. I want to turn to Michael now to talk about climate change because, look, even if we shore up democracy, even if we develop new weapons to keep us secure, this all won't matter if the planet is uninhabitable. So let's talk about the state of the climate today and how, to pick up on what both of them have said, how global politics are affecting our ability to counter, reverse climate change in the future.
Thanks, Marie. So as you say, I mean, there's changes to the physical environment that are happening in the background. At some point, we can go a little deeper, and of course, climate risks themselves. It's not just the changes to the physical environment; it's the way that the changes to the physical environment meet people and social structures and preparation. So a lot of what I work on and a lot of what Perry Woodhouse works on actually concerns that latter bit, actually thinking about what kinds of systems need to be in place to protect people. But let me try to answer your question about global politics. So the basic fact about the atmosphere is that it's well mixed, meaning that it doesn't really, unlike other kinds of pollution, if you pollute a river, it stays in the river. But when you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's mixed. Everybody deals with it. So historically, the problem has been highly advanced developed countries because they went through industrial revolutions and they continue to do things. Again, sometimes this is like they're being accused of this. I think this is great. We wanted countries to actually do industrious things and to bring people out of poverty. The thing is that there's the rest of the world that wants to do the same thing, and not unreasonably so. The rest of the world would like to lift people out of poverty, but we can't do it all the same way. And so there is this kind of underlying social contract between developed countries, emerging economies, and much poorer countries, that the developed countries have to help the developing countries take a different path. And that's a path that involves burning a lot less fossil fuels, and the bottom line. And the problem is that all the other things that everybody on the panel is talking about, and that I assume that Zaid will also talk about, interferes with that. So that kind of arrangement is only going to work by developing understanding, developing trust, and that's eroding for lots of reasons. So at kind of more micro levels, for some of the things Sarah's saying, there's great power competition of the sort that Mike was talking about, and I assume Zaid will talk about, kind of breakdown of global governance, and it makes it very difficult. So I can tell you, kind of in my world, like thinking about global policymaking and negotiations, very little happened this summer in the key milestone negotiations in June, because the world is sort of waiting to see what happens in the United States election. Because if it goes one way, then the world will involve U.S. leadership on these issues, and if it goes a different way, then the PRC and other large countries, India, with maybe Brazil, will have a very different role to play. And that's not healthy, right? So we're, in terms of how politics interacts with a physics and chemistry question, I mean, it really is that the world is sort of waiting to see which way things are going to go. This is a year in climate politics that's largely about finance, so probably if anything can break through the US election in the next 2 months, you'll start to see more and more stories in the newspaper about climate finance. And the issue is that this year, what is to be negotiated is the new goal of what's called the new collective quantified goal. And that is the goal of what developed...
It's a good UN term.
NCQG.
It's a good,
if it was real UN, I
good
would just
term.
say NCQG and expect you to know what I mean, right? But the idea is that this is the goal of what developed countries are meant to mobilize for developing countries in terms of climate finance. The previous goal has been $100 billion per year.
And that pays for what?
This pays for all of the sorts of projects that developing countries need to do, both for decarbonization, so solar plants, windmills, things like that, but even more importantly, for a lot of developing countries, it would be coastal protection, water protection, cooling centers. And that's money that the North has just barely started to be able to mobilize now at the 100 billion level. And now the question is what happens next? And so as you all know from your personal lives, once money gets involved in any question, it's more complicated. So when you have fragile global institutions anyway, and money gets involved, all those issues of trust come up. So that's where we are.
And every year there's a conference someplace different called COP. COP29 is taking place in a few months in Baku, Azerbaijan. We always send a good Penn contingent with Michael and others to COP. Can you say a little bit about, first of all, Perry Worldhouse or Penn's engagement, but also what to expect from COP this year?
Sure. Well, again, a lot depends on what happens in the US election, I'm sorry to say. COP29, Azerbaijan, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, parties here being parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Last year it was in Dubai, the year before that in Egypt, the year before that in Glasgow, so you may have heard of some of these. We've talked about them here many times. I think what to expect is the big headline will be this question of money. And one of the things, if those of you that follow kind of global finance, this is also tied up in questions about the reform of the World Bank and the IMF. It's also tied up in questions about a lot of countries, developed countries that were generous with their even bilateral development aid have redirected that to go to things like the Ukraine war. So I think that is going to be the really tense discussion. But there's other issues too, and I'll just mention two of them. One is that there's this topic of adaptation, and that again is the how to protect humans and ecosystems and infrastructure and heritage and everything else from adverse climate impacts. So a big breakthrough happened in COP28 last year on this topic, which glad to say Perry Worldhouse was part of. And I think you will see it will be less in the headlines, but real attempts to begin to articulate that further. Just as we know what the goal for the temperature is, which was this 1.5 goal, there's got to be a lot more work on articulating what these goals are for protecting humans, ecosystems, infrastructure, and so forth. And then the other thing is, long-standing interest of Perry Worldhouse is this topic of loss and damage, which is how to deal with unavoided climate impacts, and that continues to kind of be fraught. Lots of progress, but also an incredibly difficult context, and also incredibly difficult to have hard conversations about this when there's already a trust deficit. So we'll have more discussions in this very room on the topic, I'm sure.
Thank you, Michael. So Zaid, I want to turn to you and bring together a lot of the themes we've talked about. And I want to start with peacekeeping. As a former peacekeeper, we see so many conflicts happening around the world today, whether it's because of the climate crisis or democratic backsliding, or of course, great power competition like Mike has talked about. You spoke in front of the UN Security Council earlier this week about the future of peacekeeping. What do you think needs to be done to make peacekeeping more effective for communities in need and to make it safer for UN peacekeepers who are going into quite dangerous, unstable situations and putting themselves at great risk?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. I started my statement before the Security Council by recalling how 30 years ago, when I was in peacekeeping, we had a wide representation of states sending formed units, battalions, for the sake of peacekeeping. And I gave as an example Croatia, where I was serving, and we had 15 battalions from 11 countries, all corners of the globe represented. And then we also had 2 battalions in what was then the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and 2 US battalions placed under UN command, serving not far away from Russian battalions. And I remarked how the world has changed, of course, changed in a direction which isn't healthy at all, because at the moment we don't have these mechanisms, or they're eroding very quickly. There's a ferocious war occurring in Sudan, absolutely horrific, and there's no means of protecting the civilians there at the moment. We're worried about what's happening in other countries in the neighborhood. The situation in Ethiopia is raising alarm. We look further afield in Libya. It's very sort of worrisome still what's happening there. Of course, Mike referred to Yemen. We have a sepsis that is spreading through many parts of the world, and the very tools that we used to rely on are just not available or seem not to be available. The UN also used to be the principal mediator. It used to be the province of diplomats. Now we see more and more intelligence agencies taking up that particular role. And I know, Marie, you have an intelligence background, and so many members of my family also were intelligence officers. But it needs a good blend of diplomatic savvy and intelligence know-how to produce results. And at the moment, we have too much of a fragmented way of doing things. And so I worry about that, and I worry about the protection of civilians. But also, I just as someone who used to be a historian, all of this has roots, and the better we understand the roots of where all this comes from. And Mike's absolutely correct when he speaks about authoritarian systems of government, and Sarah's correct in isolating authoritarian-minded leaders in democracies. And I think it's the latter which concerns me most, because this is where the direction of travel is headed. And all of it can really be traced to Jörg Haider in 1986 in Austria, who began to pick up where Karl Röger left off in the 1890s when he spoke about the freeloader immigrants, the defense of the little people, as Karl Röger used to say, and then launched these terrible attacks on immigrant communities in Austria. And because he was telegenic and he was young, and he was the son of two Nazis, basically his parents were Nazis, he was able to appeal to many more people than just the xenophobic community. And it caused alarm in Europe when in 1999 his party was brought into government. And there were some sanctions slapped on the FPÖ in Austria, but it didn't really go very far. Because why? Because down in Italy in 1994, Berlusconi arrived and he opened the floodgates. Basically, he reintroduced hatred. And not in the sense that he hated people, but he saw that it was profitable politically to introduce hatred into the system. And so he brought the Northern League into his coalition, and later he brought, of course, Brothers of Italy, the current ruling party in Italy. So what we have now is we have the peddling of hatred as a means of shoring up political support for, in the main, rather mediocre political actors. If they're not supremos, these people, they're charlatans, and they've resorted to rather low sort of tactics, which after the Second World War, we hoped had been eschewed and driven out of the political systems, and they haven't. So the hatreds are building, as Sarah correctly said. It's not easy to dispose of them in democratic systems. They will have to go somewhere, and that's what causes the alarm that I think all of us have. And in the meantime, you have marginalized societies, those who feel embattled, facing rising sort of scorn, claims that they're criminals, and that I remember, for instance, just this last point, when I was in Austria a few years ago, when I was High Commissioner for Human Rights, it was very noticeable that any crime committed by an immigrant was given front page coverage in the media in Austria. But an equivalent crime committed by a non-immigrant was not given that sort of coverage. And that's the point that I think Sarah was making. You embellish the issue to the point where the hatred becomes then a profitable means of winning political support. But it's very, very cynical, this, and it's not genius. I mean, we know what happens when you keep doing this. And for that reason, we need to think really carefully. And I think the point that there are those who are aware enough of what's happening to try and mount strategies to battle against them. They're there, but not as coordinated as we'd otherwise want to see.
Zaid, a quick follow-up. The UN obviously can't fix all of those problems that you just mentioned. There are a lot of ways we have to attack them. But putting your UN hat on, if you had a magic wand and there are 2 or 3 things about the UN system that you could fix automatically that would help confront all of these challenges we spoke about today, what would those be?
Well, I've been on record for saying this before. I think the UN needs much stronger leadership. I mean, the leadership is really not there. And the danger is that, yes, there are parts of the UN that if they were to sort of wither away, perhaps wouldn't be so consequential. But certainly the specialized agencies, if you saw them as sort of almost degenerate, and then die off, the world would be in a very perilous state quickly. I mean, the basic architecture of the way that we run governance beyond the financial sort of systems would be in deep trouble. And so there is something that we need to protect. When it came to peacekeeping, I just told the Security Council, go back to basics. They're coming up with all these models for how they should run peacekeeping. And in the 1950s, when the Security Council was very paralyzed, basically they mandated the Secretary General of the time to go to the hotspot in question, to basically see for themselves what was happening, and then come back to the Security Council, to the international community, to say, this is what we need to do to arrest this decline in the security situation, and you need to support. And then they would sort of discuss how best to do this. Now it's not happening like that, and it needs to sort of change. I don't think, I mean, again, with a few changes, it's amazing what can happen. And if you put the right people in the right place, it's not so much a system, it's the right people in the right place. Miracles often happen, and they happen very quickly. And I think that's where I put the emphasis at the moment.
I think it's safe to say that in all 4 of these pillars, leadership really matters. We can put institutions in place, policies in place, regulations in place. At the end of the day, with the right or the wrong leaders, you get very different outcomes. Now I'd like to hear all of you from your questions. My colleague David in the back has a microphone, so please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and I will point him to you. Yes, I'm going to start right up here. And can you please introduce yourself briefly and ask a question?
Hi, Daniel Rosario, first year master's students in the Organizational Dynamics program. My question is for Professor Horowitz. A number comes up to mind, 6. 6 years is what it takes for a new technology to make it from concept to the battlefield. In your time in the DoD, trying to advance the cause of getting these technologies to get to the battlefield faster, what challenges did you see, and what progress has been made in trying to shorten that time frame, if you will?
No, that's a great question, and I think if you look at the initiatives that the Defense Department's taken over the last couple of years from an innovation perspective, there's been an emphasis on trying to accelerate innovation adoption. You see that through the elevation of the Defense Innovation Unit to report directly to the Secretary of Defense. You see that through the creation of the Office of the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Officer. You see it in a bunch of different ways. One example that I would give, and obviously this reflects my personal view, not the view of the Defense Department, is through the Replicator Initiative and its first focus, which is on the deployment of all domain attritable autonomous systems, which is like a Defense Department phrase that basically means smaller, more replaceable systems, not necessarily weapon systems. As the Deputy Secretary announced in August 2023, the goal actually explicitly of working to accelerate the fielding of thousands of these systems into the Indo-Pacific by August 2025. A really clear illustration of the attempt to take that longer cycle. And that's true for the development of lots of things. This is not a question of, this is not weapon systems in particular, although certainly applicable to that, and really accelerate it in the context of this Defense Department. And then she gave a speech on August 7th of this year, highlighting that in fact the Defense Department's on track to achieve those goals, and that required moving money, that required engaging Congress, that required trying to drive real organizational change in the Pentagon. And I think it's an example of how the leadership in the Defense Department recognizes that issue and the need to meet the urgency of the PRC pacing challenge through accelerating innovation adoption and fielding capabilities faster.
Can I ask you to very quickly define the PRC pacing challenge for those of you who, pacing is a very Pentagon word. I just want to make sure we're all level setting on terminology here.
Pacing meaning the biggest challenge and the thing that we have to measure ourselves against. And when it comes to how the Defense Department thinks about, how should the military be shaped? What kinds of systems should the Defense Department be invested in? What kinds of technologies? How should it be organized? The organizing principle is around being able to deter and if necessary defeat the challenges posed by the PRCs. That's what you're sort of focused on first and foremost. That's what pacing challenge means.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Yes, right here. There's a mic coming to you.
Hi, I'm Solmay. I'm a freshman in the college, and my question was for you, Dean. I was wondering, so social media kind of has a built-in profit incentive for sharing and inflammatory rhetoric. We are talking about like billionaires who own these media companies. I'm Franco-American, so came to mind was Borrere, who wrote, and the influence he had on the elections. So how can democracies regulate these algorithms? Can we do that through legislation? What's the best path forward?
That's a very small question. Thank you. It's a great question. First of all, regulation and regulatory practices change across geopolitical geographies. They're not always the same. Depending on, if it's a media platform that's run that is a Chinese platform, it will have a different regulatory system than a francophone one or a.
Ooh, we're going to talk about TikTok.
I was going to talk about TikTok. TikTok is really interesting, so we can talk about TikTok. But I think that the media platforms that let's just take, since the election is in 54 days in the United States, the ways in which information circulates on Truth Social, on Twitter, I don't think anyone is on Facebook anymore, on Instagram. They have regulations in place, but that is kind of tinkering with a system that is already established to create profit. And so when you're talking about a for-profit system, and you're talking about how to, like you said, as we were talking about before, hatred is lucrative. Right? And so it's really hard to think about regulations. And, there were regulations in place in different systems. Twitter had a regulatory team, and they either were fired or they left when Musk bought it, right? Because they didn't go with his version. So when you're talking about media ownership, and that is very politicized, regulation is something that they often feel is like outside of, they don't have to be concerned with that. This is a privately owned corporation. And so I think that's, that regulations are important. And please understand me, I am all for more regulations, especially for young people on social media. But I think that we actually need to think of a different kind of approach for misinformation, disinformation, for AI, for than regulations, because regulations aren't capturing this sort of spread of hatred, of misleading information, of lies, of falsehoods, in the way that we would hope it would.
What do you mean nobody's on Facebook? Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, in the back here.
Hi, this is a bit of an old school concern, but in terms of nuclear risks, do you think that, how close do you think Iran is to developing nuclear weapons? What do you think they'll do once they get them? And do you think there are risks of Russia using tactical nukes?
Thank you.
That's an easy question. I think public reporting suggests that Iran is inching ever closer to being able to develop a nuclear weapon, and certainly to having the breakout capacity to do so relatively quickly if they decide to press the go button. I think that there remains a degree of disagreement about, and I'm curious what, Marie knows a lot about Iran, what she would think about this, the extent to which they're getting ready to sort of press the go button, as to what they would do if they got nuclear weapons. Honestly, sort of unclear. There's even more disagreement sort of in that context. Nuclear weapons historically have functioned in some ways best as invasion insurance, in that the nuclear weapons have been the best protector ever invented in some ways of countries from being invaded, and so certainly that would play into what Iran sought to do. They might seek to do other things as well, and certainly it would pose an enormous threat to regional security and international politics, and something that the United States is obviously very very concerned about. In the Russia context, I would just say briefly that there's been a lot of discussion about the possibility of the use, tactical nuclear weapons or small nuclear weapons, about the use of smaller nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine. It does not seem like that is imminent or likely at this point. But things could certainly change, and certainly the Russians have sought to make it seem as though there is a risk of that, even if there isn't, to try to deter the West from being as involved as possible in the defense of Ukraine.
I'm happy to just say a quick word on Iran.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, you threw it over to me. When the Iran nuclear deal was in place, before President Trump pulled out of it, Iran was judged to be about a year away from being able to get enough fissile material to then develop a weapon, which is a separate process from the fissile material, but weaponization probably takes another set of months. Since President Trump pulled out of the deal and it's fallen apart, Iran generally is thought to be days or weeks away, if they made a strategic decision to start weaponization work quickly, to get enough fissile material, either through the uranium path or the plutonium path, to get enough to make a weapon. That doesn't mean they would have a weapon, just means they would have enough of the stuff to make one. Weaponization is really hard too. They've never successfully done that. So suffice to say, the deal wasn't perfect, but in a world where it doesn't exist, Iran is quite close if they made the decision. The last publicly available national intelligence estimate on Iran's leadership decision-making, which was during the Bush administration, so it's been a while since we talked about this publicly, was that they had not made a decision. Okay, exactly, we're getting further away from it, that they had not made a decision to go for a weapon. In the world of nuclear weapons, especially in the Middle East, strategic ambiguity is often the goal. We all know that Israel has nuclear weapons, but they don't say it publicly, right? So I think that Iran with a nuclear weapon would be incredibly dangerous. And the thing I worked on in government, and the key question is always getting into leaders' minds. Are they rational? Are they not? Would they use it? Would they not? Those are questions, as Mike said, there's disagreement in the government about that. And there's also a degree of, what did Donald Rumsfeld call it, known unknowns? It's really hard to know, but it's really scary, and that's why I think lots of people are determined to prevent Iran from actually getting that. But it's a great question. Another hand, yes, I'm going to come up here to you. Let me take two, one from each of you, so in the interest of time, we get both of your questions in. Thank you. So David, stay up here. We'll do both of these questions at the same time.
Hi, my name is Fanor. I'm a second-year Master's of Public Health student. So all of these topics definitely touch on global health, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I was interested in the specific issues that you guys brought up and how you see them interacting with either the health of populations or with kind of the funding that's needed. Off the top of my head and the notes on my phone, I saw Michael in terms of climate change and COP29, thinking about is the long-term cost of climate change in terms of health something that's being brought into these conversations, and when that funding is diverted towards the situation in Ukraine, is there also diversion of funding towards climate change as sort of a preventative measure of longer-term health consequences? And also, Zaid, I hope also it's okay using your first names, that
Very informal word.
health is a human right under the WHO Declaration, and the impacts of the various conflicts that have been mentioned. I'm thinking about like the polio vaccine current program happening right now in Gaza. I saw like a statistic that a quarter of the people injured in Gaza will need like rehabilitation and medical technology. So thinking about those resources, so those two. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And then let's take your question at the same time, and then, yes, yours. Sorry, I don't mean to point, it's very rude, but I have no other way to. And then we can do a little bit of a lightning round before we do the last question. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Deborah Harold. I'm a political scientist and a scholar of the Middle East and a great fan of Michael Horowitz. And I feel like I've argued most of my life with wonderful scholars of international relations and security, and they're wonderful. So shifting away to non-state actors or weak state actors, and also touching base with human rights, El Hol, one of these detention, security, whatever camps with either women and children, and then there are other camps for former ISIS fighters or ISIS stuck there, populations all swept into camps. So did the United States learn anything about Abu Ghraib as a massive recruiting organization or system for anti-American focus? And now we have something that's catching children much earlier, right? As boys move from this big to this big, they move to the other camp where the violence and the gender-based violence against boys starts right away. And then back to that non-state actor or weak state actor, we can talk about incredibly sophisticated weapon systems, and the US and the Middle East seem to be on the verge or much closer to a regional war, and there are no fancy weapon systems involved in the Hamas attacks on Israel. And that was so amazingly devastating for Israel, despite all the surveillance that was available. All that money, all that effort, all those smart people, but other people working hard were able to overcome it. So where are we with human rights abuses or things that are being committed by countries that feel themselves committed to stopping human rights abuses? It seems to damage the larger project of human rights. It seems to damage US power. And I don't want to say every kid is a future terrorist, but it certainly leads to a massive and expanding lack of trust that's really hard to overcome. So I'd like to hear from our security person and our democracy person, and these places are also in the middle of very hot regions and have health issues, and it's a human rights issue. So I'll stop here. It's not an easy issue, but it has so many connections, interconnections, and tragic aspects.
And I think it just demonstrates how all of these pillars work together. They don't operate in vacuums. I actually want to start with Zaid, if that's okay with the panelists on the Zaid. There were a lot of the public health questions, the questions that the professor raised. Anything you want to weigh in on in any of those, and then we'll go to the people here. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, to both of the questioners. The first one on public health and climate, I leave Michael to deal with the climate part, but clearly, as we see the globe heating up, what we notice is that seasonal spread of certain vectors of disease are being extended. So the threat to human habitats is increasing, virus spillover, the spread of potentially zoonotic pathogens also increasing. I was in Brazzaville about 2 weeks ago for the meeting of the African Regional Committee of the WHO, looking into Mpox. And sadly, and this is again a sign of the fragmentation and the weakness of the entire system, sadly, we learned that, for example, Nigeria received its first batch of Mpox vaccines 2 years after they first requested them. 2 years. it makes you really wonder. I then went to Geneva for the pandemic negotiations, and where the pharmaceutical industry began to show further signs of flexibility when it comes to the negotiating of a pandemic accord. But such is the betrayal felt by the African countries, particularly after Omicron was sequenced by the Namibians and the South Africans, for which they received no benefits for doing so, that the Africans didn't turn up to the preparatory meetings that we had in Geneva prior to the pandemic negotiations beginning again. So the whole system is just hanging on by a thread, and we're entirely vulnerable to the next pathogen. Anything close to something like the, AIDS, HIV type of pathogen, a sure killer that moves slowly through populations we have no defense for at the moment. And there's no treaty that at the moment, will provide the protections we all need. So it is alarming, and we have to focus on that. Clearly also the impact of climate is being felt, and MPOX, I think, shows this. In terms of human rights and non-state actors and states, I mean, clearly extremist groups, violent extremist groups, commit outrages which horrify all of us and ought to be condemned at every turn. I mean, must be. But the greatest threat to human rights really doesn't come from them. It comes from the states themselves. It's the states that need to provide, they are duty bound to provide the populations with protections, and yet the state is often the major threat to it. So it's a very strange thing you have to think of. It's almost like if we don't trust ourselves as human beings, then we need to find means by which we can either calm ourselves, or you sort of medicate yourself if you have violent tendencies. Well, states need to do the same thing, because if it were not for the sort of human rights protections, then of course they can migrate to positions which threaten the population. And going back to Mike's point, I think the original point in terms of technology and use of AI, much of it really depends on whether the population trusts in the leadership of the country. If you're trusting, you're willing to give up certain freedoms, and you understand that in exchange you have protections. But if there's no trust, then you clearly worry that whatever information you're giving up will be used against you, as we saw in previous, much darker times that humanity had to navigate through. So I'm sorry for that sort of rather meandering response.
No, thank you, Zaid. And I know we are very close to time. I'm going to take 3 more minutes, if you would allow me, and let each of our panelists on stage answer a variety parts of those 2 questions, or also, so we don't all end depressed, give a bright spot you see. Mike, I'll start with you.
Sure. Let me defer to my fellow panelists on the questions that were asked in general, and talk about a bright spot, which is it's an enormous privilege to be back at the university right now. But one of the real bright spots for me from being in the government the last couple of years was getting a chance to work with the incredibly talented civil servants, military officers, and other folks that every day are working to make our country a better place, a safer place, a place that's consistent with our values, and getting to see them working every day to do that, and getting a chance to serve with them was really inspirational in thinking about the number of people, including people in this audience, that every day are doing what they can to make our country a better place. I am generally an optimist. Things go wrong in the world quite a bit. But we actually tend to avoid the worst case consequences most of the time.
I'm knocking on wood right here.
And we do that best when we work together.
Thank you. Sarah?
I love that answer. I think that it is really true that it's a time for us to be optimistic, even as we're really vigilant and carefully thinking through what these different obstacles to democracy, to security, to human rights, to the climate might be. I'm just going to pivot really quick to go to a negative thing, and then I'll come back to the hope, because I just want to address your question. I think that one of the things, and this kind of relates to the question earlier about regulation, that it's not just in these camps that young boys are radicalized. Young boys who have absolutely, kind of no search history or interest in looking up radicalization, who just go online to, go and look at sports, are being fed by algorithms to get them to kind of go further and further down different rabbit holes that lead to radicalization. So this is something that regulation doesn't kind of cover. So we need a different way to think about how to, kind of train algorithms in a different way. We made those algorithms. We can unmake the way that they are working now. And we, created media platforms and decided, at least here, that they would be privately owned. We can change that as well. I think that the hopeful note, what do I see as a bright spot? And this goes to something that Zaid said as well. I think that we are seeing, we've been talking about things like how hatred circulates, how hatred becomes a political practice. I think we are also seeing how joy becomes a political practice, and how joy is something that so many of us, because of climate change, because of security issues, because of human rights violations, are thinking about how is it that we can harness again joy and hope in terms of how we organize our lives and our governments and our state. And so I'm an optimist too. And I think that moving towards joy and not thinking that that is something that we do in our spare time or when we, aren't busy with our jobs, but actually incorporating joy and compassion into our workplaces and into the way in which we understand the world is what we need to do.
Michael, bring us out, follow that. That's tough.
I won't even try. So just to briefly answer your question and to try to connect it to optimism, there's increasing recognition that the health consequences of climate change are at the forefront of its impacts. And that has kind of been known but diffused in the scientific community. It was really concretized in the latest batch of IPCC reports. And then interestingly, for the first time, politically, it got taken up in this past year. So in Dubai in 2023. And what is good about that is it now is sort of an explicit goal. So Zaid mentioned some of the risks, but there's this explicit goal, which essentially is that the world commits to there being no excess mortality or morbidity due to climate change. Now that's a that's a huge goal, and just to understand what it would take to meet that goal is, I think, a huge intellectual challenge, one that I hope that this university can play a really important role in, and I think we should. And then that brings me to a bit of optimism. So one is that I think there are places like universities, like this university, that can actually help at least understand what it takes for that goal. I mean, we're not going to mobilize trillions of dollars for that goal, but at least we could articulate what it would take, what kinds of protections are necessary, and really make them really perspicuous and really put them in front of the people that can make that happen. And then I think what also makes me a little bit optimistic, even despite everything we all have said about the kind of system unraveling, there are really good actors. There are the ones that Mike mentioned, like lots of them in the United States government, but there are also all kinds of countries, some of which are quite small, who have played an outsized role in bringing these kinds of issues. The ones I know the best are climate, but bringing them to the attention of people. And the truth is, can often get countries, like, for example, this one that we're sitting in, to sometimes act against their just narrow prudential interests and actually think a little bit in terms of global solidarity. So I've been lucky to help with some of that, work with some of those countries. But I think that is a real bright spot and one of the few places where we can look to kind of global governance and say, wow, sometimes it is really significant and it really is worth trying to bring everybody together to talk through these things. But there's a lot of frustration and gray hair and indigestion and sleepless nights that goes along with it. But I think none of us would be doing the kind of work that we do if we actually didn't have a bit of a stubborn, optimistic streak inside.